From Agatha to Owl House, Willow to Wicked, the rise of the queer witch on our screens has been a long time coming. Before we go any further, it's probably good to define what we mean by witch in this video specifically. I'm going to be telling about the fictional witch, rather than necessarily any current belief system or identity. The witch as a mythological figure, as a historical scapegoat, as a modern image of a black pointed hat and broomstick or possession of dark cottagecore powers tied to the earth. When writers decide to make a character a witch, what is behind that decision, and why do so many witches resonate with queer audiences? Witches, in the most general sense, are anyone who has magical abilities outside of mainstream religious beliefs. But there is a pervasive image in Western culture of the witch as specifically a woman. It's pretty easy to see the initial appeal for queer women looking for fictional figures to relate to or find connection with here. The idea of an internal power source separate from social structures controlled by straight and cis men. There is something implicitly radical about this very setup. The witch's power comes from within. Spells allow these women to access a kind of agency potentially denied by the circumstances of their place in social hierarchies. When we compare that to the foundational Christian image of magical or miraculous events coming from a single outside source, prayers as a call for help rather than a sense of full control, where chances can be improved by being devout to stringent beliefs, which has often included demonization of queerness and queer people, I don't think it's hard to see why stories of witchcraft feel so powerful to many queer audiences. I actually made a video about queer witches many years ago, one of the first videos that I ever made on this channel about queer topics, in fact. And it was only like 5 minutes long, I think. And this expanded video was actually requested during a Patreon Q&A years ago. And it finally felt like it was time. Because back then, I was very surprised by the lack of on-screen narratives which had canonically included queerness in their stories of witchcraft. It felt like a narrative primed for it, right? The metaphors of self-discovery, the ties to a sinful sexuality, the found family trope of the coven, and so much more. In the years between, there has indeed been an explosion of queer witches, all touching on aspects that I'd picked out in that original video. And so I wanted to dive into them today, especially since when the first episode of the new show Agatha All Along dropped, many of us spotted a potential queer element to the story and I guess hoped that it would be more than just heavy queer coding. And as I write this, we are 6 episodes into the season and oh boy, this video has become so much more relevant than I even thought it would be. So settle in, grab a drink, maybe a little snack. As always, those of you who have ADHD like me, I guess continue to do whatever important task that you are doing while listening to this video as we dive into the magical world of queer witches. Self-discovery. One of the most iconic images of pop culture witchhood is the teenage witch. Obviously, the so-titled Sabrina is the most classic of the bunch, but there are many other examples of young witches to choose from. The appeal here, I think, is rooted in the parallel experiences and potential metaphors in the adolescent experience compared with the experience of a fictional witch. And this is then compounded when we add queerness to the mix. The idea of having a secret part of yourself that you might have to keep hidden, or a newfound power or sense of identity, or a shared history with others like yourself outside of your family. A lot of teen media, especially about girls, is about social relationships, feeling left out or different, or grappling with the onset of sexual and romantic desire, and in turn, your own desirability. The coming-of-age narrative is one of self-discovery and beginnings of independence, and fits so perfectly with the figure of the queer witch. So, with examples, let's start with Agatha All Along, since I've already mentioned it. A show about the antagonist from previous Marvel show WandaVision, Agatha Harkness. Agatha is a witch who has been trapped in a containment spell since the events of the previous show concluded. And this new series is about what happens when a mysterious gothy teen breaks the spell and demands that she helps him complete the magical trial known as the Witch's Road. This teen's identity is secret for the first half of the show, but is eventually revealed to be Wanda's son Billy in a new body. Now, I know in the literal story of Billy Kaplan, he is the classic tale of a boy who dies in a tragic car accident and is possessed by a magical gay ghost at his bar mitzvah, but I don't think it's hard to see the queer experience playing out in the flashback episode of the show here, where a young teen goes through this rite of passage into cultural adulthood, ending with a newfound understanding but also confusion about himself and the world around him. His heterosexual family members can tell something is different about him, like they love him, but they secretly want the old him back too. There's something in that experience that will resonate with many queer young viewers, I think, because we have in this show an interesting type of representation that we've seen elsewhere in shows like In the Flesh, where writers give us literal canonical representation, but also layer it with metaphorical representation too. Instead of having the blue aliens representing Indigenous people, for example, but failing to actually give a voice to Indigenous people themselves in the story, Agatha is steeped in canonical queerness, but also shows these exaggerated experiences parallel to this in the supernatural elements. When Agatha tells Billy, "Don't you dare feel guilty. You broke the rules, big deal. That's what makes you special. That's what makes you a witch." It feels like the words of a queer elder encouraging a young person to not be ashamed of who they are. This connection of othering, queerness, and the metaphors of witchcraft was a key part in the craft's legacy's inclusion of trans and bi characters at the centre of the story too, with Zoe Lister-Jones explaining. This film was an incredible opportunity to portray the world as it actually exists, and especially when looking at young people and the ways in which young people can be othered. I really wanted to include queer and trans characters in that conversation. Whether I would categorise this film as feminist, in any discussion of feminism or looking at feminist issues, trans and queer voices must be included, so that was really important to me. Her transness is not central to her character in a kind of like self-discovery, coming out, transition storyline kind of way, but is something that is commented on within her character and those around her. It's something that she picks up on other people about when they kind of have this trans misogynistic or cisnormative language. It is also something that she talks about, the idea of like trans girls having their own kind of magic as well. It's not entirely then followed through on in terms of giving us more details, but it is the kind of thing that was clearly important to the filmmakers, and I think opens up ideas of what those kind of trans like girl witch characters might look like in the future. It feels fitting to have these canonical aspects of a sequel to the iconic original made by queer filmmaker Andrew Fleming. A group of girls struggle with both personal and societal ills through sexism, racism, and mental health crises. There is this element in the original film, I think, that shows coming of age as this process of coming from the individual to the communal. Their spells were personal, often around outward appearance, and revolved around small acts of vengeance. They're teenagers trapped in their small school world. They're laser focused on their own personal difficulties, and their heady taste of power is limited by their own youthful experiences and outlooks. They wish revenge on a racist bully, not a way to fight the white supremacist system more widely. They wish beauty for themselves, but not to be accepted for who they actually are. One view of this is that it feeds into the short-sighted, self-obsessed teen girl stereotypes. The desires for beauty and romantic love are positioned within the social framework of our current society. Well, of course, this is what girls want. It's a society that encourages girls to want these things and then demonizes them for wanting them at the same time. It kind of plays out in the film when you have the idea of the girl who wants to get rid of her scars becoming this massive narcissist, or the girl who wants to be wanted by a boy is then threatened with attempted assault because he wants her just so much he can't stop. The girl gang bonding in the craft is then steeped in negativity when they turn on each other, painting female friendship as mob mentality, using suicide and self-harm closely associated with young women as weapons against each other. So is this a movie damning girls and magic entirely? Well, the end of the film suggests otherwise. Sarah, the girl that they ultimately turned on, is the only one to retain her powers as a reward for not being corrupted. This process of self-realization, removing yourself from toxic understandings of girlhood and power, is a positive journey amongst the darkness. However, for many queer audiences, it's actually the chaotic figure of villainous Nancy who resonated most. Queer journalist Alex Hall explained the appeal, even in a movie without explicit queer characters. We recognise something queer about the film's brand of teen girl defiance and anger. In particular, Nancy's volatile sexuality made me squirm. Every time Nancy made an explicitly lesbian remark, see, I love a woman in uniform, my skin prickled. A queer villain, a working class witch, and a sexual assault survivor, Nancy manifested her power and resistance by hungering and devouring the scent of girls, then viciously murdering predatory high school boys. Rarely was teen girl pleasure represented as anything but monstrous in the media I consumed at the time. For Nancy, though, there was a delight in the politics of female monstrosity, in the way it enables the destruction of norms. Although many fictional witches are from magical bloodlines, for some their existence as a witch is pulled out as a clear difference from their own family. For queer witches, this creates a double distance from parents or siblings. That feeling of being different is all-encompassing, and although they might try and understand, their families don't really know what either experience is like. Take, for example, Willow from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, probably the most iconic queer teen witch character. In the witch hunt episode Gingerbread, the town becomes obsessed with uncovering witches in their midst, who they believe killed 2 local children. Willow is discovered to have occult symbols and texts in her locker at school and goes home to find her mother sitting down to have a talk with her. She begins to try and explain, but her mother interrupts, saying it wasn't unexpected, but lots of girls try out at this age. And she concludes, "I wish you could have identified as something a little less icky." The whole tone is dismissive and humiliating for Willow. Her mum calling her delusional, wrapping it up in concern, saying she's only worried about Willow, that she's doing it for attention, that it's a cry for discipline. And it's a clear parallel to the image of a child coming out to their parent, only to be told that their identity is just a phase. Her mum bans Willow from seeing Buffy because it's clear where this little obsession came from. Willow's occult knowledge sets her apart from her fellow Scoobies. It gives her a purpose within the group. She has to study and research, but it's self-directed. It's something that she comes to be proud of. That bookish aspect of her character in earlier seasons, which had always been a source of bullying and unpopularity, becomes intrinsically connected to her magic and her queerness. In fact, Willow's magic and her sexuality become increasingly linked throughout the series. Her romantic interest in other women, particularly her relationship with Tara, fostered through their shared interest in this feminine communal power and knowledge. During their most iconic on-screen kiss, they literally float off the ground together, manifesting magic in this beautiful, instinctual and unconscious way that serves to make their love feel even more special. We see a more extreme example of magic and queerness as thematic motifs for self-discovery, with Tara split from her abusive family. Initially, Tara is restricted to her role as Willow's love interest in the show, with little known about her life outside their relationship. But in the episode Family, we find out part of that is a deliberate attempt to keep the truth from people who are now close to her. Tara has been told from a young age that the girls in her family are demonic and cursed by this heritage, and that as they mature into women, they inevitably turn evil. She attempts to hide this side of herself from the rest of the gang by doing a spell to conceal her demonic side, but it ends up making other demons invisible too, giving them an advantage in attacking Sunnydale victims. Tara's family then explains that to protect the McClay women and other people that they might hurt, they are dutifully kept at home. They attempt to force Tara back with them after revealing how supposedly dangerous she is to the gang. Although hurt by her keeping such a huge secret, Willow and the rest of their friends refuse to let her be taken. The idea of a traditional family wanting to keep their daughter locked into a subservient relationship with men, claiming that something she discovers about herself as she goes through puberty, which makes her feel different and alone, is an evil within her that she can't escape. It's very much giving homophobic religious upbringing. Extremely metaphor of them. It's revealed in the episode that this tale demonic heritage is entirely fabricated, and this discovery empowers Tara to cast aside her biological family for her new one, who protected her even when they didn't know the story was false. Found family and true connection. This idea of found family is central to much queer storytelling, history, and current experiences of queerness, and it fits so perfectly with the image of the witch's coven, a group bound together by ties of choice, who gain strength from each other, who are more powerful together, who care deeply for each other. A family not necessarily made through romantic or sexual connection, but platonic and familial bonds of love too. Tara and Willow both found this in their connection with the Buffy gang, but they are far from the only examples. The popular Disney animated show The Owl House is a pretty classic demonstration of this, following main character Luz and her adventures in the demon realm, where she meets a fellow teen and witch Amity, who becomes her love interest, as well as a surrogate parental figure in the similarly queer witch Ida. Luz in the normal world is a weird little nerd, but in the new world of magic, she finds a place that she could belong. The show's overarching messaging is essentially that not only is difference okay, but it's actually a strength and power that opposes oppressive conformity and can create bonds that are uniquely special. Witches in this world are the norm, and Thus, covens are too. The Owl House, therefore, makes an interesting decision in this fictional reality. Covens become the only officially mandated collective for witches, and Ida's refusal to join one is what marks her as an outsider and a criminal. In the queer reading of the show, covens are equivalent social relationships sanctioned by normative society, like marriages or family units with 2.5 kids. The anti-coven found family that is created is therefore this show's equivalent of what covens symbolize in other witch media, a source of community, comfort, and love for those who cannot or won't fit into the expectations of social propaganda. This idea of covens as normative parts of world building is also baked into the concept of TV show Motherland Fort Salem, about an alternate America where the Salem witch trials ended with freedom from persecution for witches, who are now used by the US military as conscripted soldiers. The relationship between Abigail, Raelle, and Tally is the centre of the show in a sisterhood that includes secrets and conflict, but also their enduring bonds. As journalist Valerie Ann put it, motherhood is about sisterhood, not blood relations, not actual siblinghood, but the bonds of very different witches thrust into similar difficult situations. They entered basic training together with certain expectations about what it would be like, and had the rug ripped out from under them at every turn, forcing them to hold on to each other if they had any hope of surviving. One by one, people they thought they could trust and respect let them down, until all they could really count on was each other. This idea of a coven connection being more complex than a conflict-free sisterly bond adds this level of reality, I think. The perfect girl gang who never disagree or argue or challenge each other is a nice image, but feels like a disservice to the complexities that we want to see in representation of found family. It's also significant that this sense of found family is not just a stand-in for queerness, but is layered atop the very queer central romance between characters Raelle and Scylla, which is a core relationship across the show's seasons. They are on two sides of the political conflict in the show, with Scylla ordered to bring Raelle into her superiors at the anti-witch conscription terrorist organisation The Spree. We see all the classic action romance tropes play out between them, but without this cis-heteronormative idea of the woman as the constant victim or liability. Their love for each other is used against them, secrets between them testing the limits of their beliefs, the spy falling for their mark trope, just classic epic love story trope, you know? The heightened stakes within stories of witchcraft and magic also add an epic quality to the queer relationships in the highly underrated teen horror trilogy from Netflix, Fear Street. The movies tell the story of a group of teens, but particularly a pair of queer girls, Dina and Sam, in the modern day fighting a generational curse, but also a queer witch from the 1600s whose fate is bound to theirs. It's very much a film series that you have to watch together, as the three films continue right on from each other, with the overarching quest narrative being to defeat the evil spirit of the witch ghost and local legend Sarah by reuniting her buried body with her missing hand. Except when our hero Dina brings the two together, instead of destroying the scary influence of the witch, it throws Dina back in time to 1666 into the body of Sarah herself to live out the events up to her death. It wasn't that Dina needed to defeat Sarah, but to understand her, and so understand the truth of her history and the town's present. It is apt that Dina is the one to act as a voice for Sarah, as we find out that she too is a queer girl falling in love with her friend Hannah. After the two kiss, strange tragedies start occurring in the village in the 1600s, and Sarah's own internalized homophobia leads her to question if her sinful behaviour is behind these misfortunes. Soon after, the local pastor commits a mass murder of 12 local children, and at a town meeting, it is Sarah and Hannah who are accused of witchcraft and blamed for the man's actions. Hannah is captured and due to be executed come morning, but Sarah escapes. While hiding from the villagers hunting her, she inadvertently finds the real cause of the curse is a local widower who had been friendly with her and her family, who has made a pact with the devil. She offers to share the power and money that come with the deal with her, but she rejects it. Her hand is severed in the ensuing fight to escape. Sarah then gives her life up to save Hannah, confessing to witchcraft but claiming that she acted alone. Sarah and Dina are these two queer girls experiencing first love who throw themselves into danger to protect the girls that they have fallen for. Their connections aren't perfect, but they are powerful. Community in Fear Street is not just about the friends and family that you live amongst, but also the history and legacy that passes from generation to generation. Dina and Sam ending the movie at a picnic date by Sarah's grave is as much an act of coven sisterhood as casting a spell together would have been. At this point, I just want to take a moment to beat the Rowan doesn't game allegations with a quick ad read from today's sponsor, June's Journey. I've swapped Agatha's unhinged detective for a much less dishevelled June Parker, 1920s detective attempting to solve the murder of her sister while uncovering her family's very many secrets, lies, and mysteries. Now, I'm not the most naturally talented person when it comes to memories, so playing this is always a fun challenge with needing to find hidden clues and patterns across the Parker mansion and further afield, and remembering where you found those objects further before. Like, these scenes are detailed, making me feel much less judged for my maximalist and cluttered ADHD aesthetic, you know? It's free to download and play, and although I had seen the game before, I always wondered whether it would have like any queer representation, and I'm happy to report that they did not use a historical setting to get out of including a bunch of queer characters. I actually read an interview with one of the writers, Dan, about how he felt that made the inclusion even more important. Like, there's a trans showgirl in Vegas, a pair of queer spies in A Story of Lies and Betrayal, and a bohemian artist trying to make it big, and many more, which all link into historical insights into queer life from that time, which obviously I love. If you want to try it yourself, you can download June's Journey for free using the link in the description or the QR code on screen. It's available on Android and iOS mobile devices as well as on PC through Facebook Games. Alright, back to the witches. Isolation and ostracization. The need for these bonds is beyond mere preference. Because the witch doesn't fit into heteronormative society, she must either stand outside of it, like the Owen sisters in Practical Magic, or try to assimilate, like Samantha in Bewitched. In both these examples, the social marginalization of witches provides great pain or conflict to the central characters. In Practical Magic specifically, there are schoolyard taunts, odd stares, people crossing to the other side of the road, Sally not being chosen to be on the mum phone tree, small but stinging rejections that isolate Sally from her hometown. In the musical Wicked, a huge part of the queer resonance of Elphaba, our green-skinned heroine who is often headcanoned as queer by fans, is the way that she's looked down on by her peers and even her own family. She's born green and from that moment is treated as an outsider. Her own father disowns her for this trait that she can't control. Only those like Glinda, who end up being forced to actually get to know her, are willing to look beneath her difference and ultimately learn to love and respect her. But even the support of the ever popular and adored Glinda isn't enough to keep the wolves from her door when societal fears are stoked and a mob relentlessly hunts her down across Oz. It isn't enough for her to remove herself from society, society will chase her down regardless. However, other witches relish the freedom that they find outside of societal norms. Agatha, for example, has no desire to actually be part of Westview, the suburban town that she refers to as a cesspool. She doesn't care about what her neighbours think about her because she doesn't care about said neighbours themselves. Her experiences of ostracisation from even her own family have long since created a bitterness towards others before they can hurt her. It's easy to understand how a queer audience might find these portrayals of marginalisation relatable, and in the case of witches who find their own peace outside of mainstream acceptance, even inspirational. When we see characters like Samantha or Sally struggle to achieve the domesticity that comes so easily to their neighbours, it reminds queer audiences of how hard it can be to achieve respectability when society doesn't respect you. At the start of their stories, they can only find social comfort if they repress their witchcraft, aka their authentic selves. The choice between isolation and authenticity rings true for many queer audiences. And when they see these witch characters like Agatha or Circe or Ursula not need that societal validation, it reminds these audiences that maybe they don't need that validation either. These characters aren't excluded from society, they're liberated from it. The only approval they need is their own. Because likewise, queer people have historically formed our own societies and subcultures. Agatha, interestingly, is twice ostracized. She can't fit into human society, but she's also been shut out of the Society of Witches. In fact, the majority of Agatha's new coven members during this new show have also been twice marginalized, whether it's a generational curse, a bad fortune, or having their magic bound. These witches lost the community they thought that they once had, which is also a queer experience itself. Being part of the gay community doesn't mean that you automatically have a community to be part of. It can be a lonely experience, especially when you're first coming out or if you don't fit the mainstream gay spaces available to you. Trans queer people, disabled queer people of colour can face additional obstacles of isolation, for example. Sinful sex and deranged gender. But what is behind this idea that witches are not allowed to be welcomed into mainstream society? In Macbeth, the first observation made about the Weird Sisters is how their appearances do not conform with gendered expectations. You should be women, Banquo says, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. Witches might overwhelmingly be portrayed as women, but they're often not good at being women, at least not in the way that society wants them to be. In many cases, in both appearance and behaviour, fictional witches provide a narrative foil to the feminine ideal of the heroine or love interest. Storytellers have often looked at what women should be and then made witches do the opposite. While the original intent of those gender non-conforming characters might have been to repulse the audience, it makes sense that a queer audience would find liberation in these characters instead in many cases. And so in this section, I want to look at some of the ways that witches subvert the expectations of womanhood, being attracted and attractive to men, being the right balance of chaste and sexually available, and being natural caregivers. So firstly, witches frequently fall outside of mainstream standards of beauty. There's the bearded Weird Sisters, the snarling Wicked Witch of the West, Margaret Hamilton, the icon that you are, and the bald and disfigured women described in Roald Dahl's The Witches. There's this implication of unattractive women as inherently wrong or unnatural that often feeds into a different trope of villainy being tied to disfigurement that I'm actually going to be talking about in my next video essay, so stay tuned for that, I guess. Roald Dahl's witches initially appear attractive only to reveal their true ugly forms later. This trope of the beautiful maiden turning into a hideous witch crops up again and again in witch narratives. Think about how the Red Witch randomly got old for that one scene in Game of Thrones, or the Queen from Snow White transforming herself into a withered crone, or Ursula disguising herself as Vanessa, or the Witch of the Waste in Howl's Moving Castle starting off slim and glamorous and then slowly becoming fatter, older and more haggard, all things that show a woman's supposed descent into being a metaphorical waste herself within mainstream narratives. I notice here how becoming ugly also here means becoming old. There's a whole subgenre of witch stories that I guess you could dub the witch craves youth plot, as seen in Tangled, Stardust, Into the Woods, that revolve around a witch going to desperate lengths to stay young, even if it means kidnapping, torturing, or killing innocents, especially children. But for every vanity witch who desires to look more beautiful, there is also a witch who revels in her ugliness. Dahl's witches delight in taking off their gloves, wigs, and shoes. In the film adaptation, you hear sighs of relief as they remove these socially acceptable gender signifiers that were clearly not made for their bodies. They view these beauty standards as a burden, a forced assimilation. Witch Hazel in Looney Tunes takes great pride in being the world's ugliest witch. Ursula drops the Vanessa disguise as soon as she gets what she wants and returns to her true form. But even when witches are conventionally attractive, there's something still a bit wrong with them. At least wrong under a cis and heteronormative society. In the Odyssey, Circe, one of the earliest depictions of witchhood, is described as beautiful. She has lovely hair, but she's also dangerous. Wild beasts lay tame at her feet. She drugs Odysseus's crew and transforms them into pigs, and she is the one who initiates sex with Odysseus. In these ways, Circe represents a subversion of the natural order. The wild becomes tamed, men become beasts, and women become a sexual agent rather than a sexual object. Which then leads to our queer witches, who subvert the expectations of female sexuality through their queerness itself. A classic recent example would be Prudence in the new Sabrina TV show, a canonically queer full witch who acts as the mean girl enemy to Sabrina on a social level. She is devoted to serving Satan and loyal to Father Blackwood, desperate for approval and belonging, but searching for it in places that ultimately don't serve her. She's also unapologetically sexually liberated, finding gratification in a little bit of, torture and pain, enjoying the odd bit of wild group sex. The show perhaps didn't do the best job at diving into the potential of her character's motivations and loyalties as they could have, but fans have run with the possibilities when discussing her character. One writer, Aki E, explaining, "This is the type of queer character that I've been waiting for. someone who is black and refuses to come second place to some pretty little white girl. As an aspiring fiction writer, Prudence's character allows me to step back, observe my black and queer identity, then begin to build a character that queer black people can celebrate, just as we are celebrating Prudence's character. One of the most significant character moments in Agatha All Along so far occurred when the ghost of Agatha's mother tells her that she has always been evil and should have been killed the moment that she was born. Where the other witches cower before Agatha's mother, Rio, Agatha's ex, stands her ground, refusing to let Agatha be taken. This whole thing gets to be gay on two levels, right? One level is that Agatha and Rio are queer. This is a moment of loyalty to a former partner. It's romantic to see Rio become protective. But level two is that this "you were born evil" kind of narrative reads just like a homophobic, hyper-Christian mum disowning her child. This is another example of using a metaphor to parallel real homophobia within queer narratives that I talked about earlier in the video. At its best, it gives audiences a new way to understand a common queer experience without rehashing trauma on screen that might alienate queer viewers or sacrificing the genre or tone of the piece. It's also sometimes just more fun. Like, you know, maybe we'd rather see Agatha be possessed by her mum than see her be sent to a conversion therapy camp. Finally, above all, women should be maternal. Women should love kids, having them, raising them, taking care of them, and it should come easily. But witches take a different approach. In Hansel and Gretel, the witch presents a magical and maternal front with a cozy gingerbread cottage only to kidnap the children and, try and eat them. In Rapunzel, the witch, presumably unable to have a child of her own, essentially tricks a couple into giving their baby to her to raise as her own. She turns out to be a terrible mother who locks her daughter in a tower for her entire life, so there we go. In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the White Witch tricks Edmund by acting towards him in a motherly fashion to gain his trust. When she turns on him, she not only betrays Edmund, but the societal obligation of women to protect children. And in The Little Mermaid, both the story and the film, the Sea Witch, or Ursula, encourages Ariel to endanger herself and exploits her naivety for her own gain. More recent bad with kids witches that come to mind might be Melisandre in Game of Thrones, R.I.P. Shireen Baratheon, and of course, Agatha. There's a whole backstory subplot that may well become more relevant in the coming episodes about whether or not Agatha traded her firstborn child in exchange for the Book of the Damned. The suspicion around whether Agatha is the worst kind of mother underscores her categorization as evil, a label that the show is starting to question. Agatha and Billy provide a more nuanced version of the witch-child relationship. Unlike other witches, Agatha doesn't particularly want to hurt children, but she's certainly not above it. In one division, she hurts Billy and Tommy to gain the upper hand over their mother Wanda in their climactic fight, for example. She doesn't go out of her way to harm children, her focus is on Wanda, but she also doesn't seem to care if Wanda's spell children Billy and Tommy get hurt either. In Agatha All Along, she shows moments of maternal behaviour, like when Billy nearly dies from a glass shard and she is clearly distraught at the idea of his passing. But for every moment of genuine care, there are 3 others where she is actively endangering his life by tying him up or encouraging him to drink poison, for example. But then Billy also subverts the role of the wide-eyed child victim of the witch's trickery. While he initially appears as the wide-eyed ingenue ripe for exploitation, the latest episode revealed that he's been pulling a lot of the strings all along. Billy has way more power than he lets on, more power than Agatha currently has, in fact. And for most of the series, he's been manipulating Agatha and the other witches. He has potentially just killed 2 of the witches in Agatha's coven and tries to kill Agatha herself, a move that gains Agatha's respect rather than provoking her enmity. Both of them are dangerous and neither are entirely innocent, but they both need each other to get to the end of the road. This renegotiation of the imposed roles of caregiver and child feels like a rebellion against cis and heteronormative gender roles. By lingering in the nuance between good and bad mothers, Agatha's character is able to transcend motherhood as a primary label. For better or worse, she is not defined by motherhood or the loss of her child or her relationship to children in general. It's simply a part of who she is. We see a similar pattern in the long headcanon to be queer character of Regina in Once Upon a Time, an evil queen and sorceress who is a long-time villain and part-time tragic heroine of the show. She's literally based on a character who is so obsessed with her own power and beauty that she conspired to have some poor girl killed so she could be fairest in the land. In the show, initially, a large part of the darkness of her character is rooted in her role as Henry's adopted mother. She is the usurper of Emma, Henry's biological mother, who is the hero of the show and the literal saviour of the world. The story begins with Henry having run away from Regina. We then see Regina threaten Emma, attempt to poison her, and, rip out her mother's heart or whatever. not giving good and loving mother, She insists that she loves Henry, but it's Emma, his real mother, whose little forehead kiss breaks the curse on him in the season 1 finale. Regina's maternal love, such that it is, manifests as violence and jealousy. She's a witch figure with a child, but she's doing it wrong. We eventually see her own mother, who chose power over love and gave Regina a truly terrible example to live by, which starts to explain some things. The show does give Regina some classic redemption arcs, and eventually her genuine love for Henry, even if she shows it in some messed up ways sometimes, is part of that redemption for the audience. There are, of course, other witches who are good mothers or caretakers, like Debbie Reynolds' character in Halloween Town, or Sally Owens and her aunts in Practical Magic, or Glinda the Good Witch in Wizard of Oz. Excellent mothers, caregivers, or magical mentors all round. However, these women are sometimes unmarried or have children outside of wedlock, or they raise children by themselves, or they don't consult a man for advice. And so even when witches are good with kids, they are still dangerous from a patriarchal standard for the very reason that they don't need a patriarch at all. Persecution and death. Okay, so I started writing this section thinking that I would be talking about the connections between the long-standing persecution of queer people and the ideas of witch hunts, and I will get onto that, but something started scratching at my brain because unfortunately it's not just queer people who love witches. Turns out TERFs love them too. For example, one certain former children's author who used to write about witches and now dedicates her one wild and precious life to making sure that things get worse for trans people, once promoted a shop with a lot of transphobic merch, including stickers that said things like lesbians don't have penises and badges proclaiming fuck your pronouns. But alongside these products were t-shirts that said this witch doesn't burn, or a hoodie that said we are the witches back from the dead, and a troublemaking witch glitter sticker. TERF's enjoyment of and connection with witches lies fundamentally in their brand of falsified persecution. In the eyes of those using witches as slogans, they aren't making potions or flying brooms, but they're being hunted, burned and killed. One of the many issues with TERF ideology is their own supposed persecution is baked into their political identity and allows them to justify the suffering of others against this exaggerated boogeyman that's going after them. In their minds, they are Sarah Good in Salem. This inner narrative creates a feeling of righteousness that shields them from any good faith criticism even. This narrative permits a billionaire, say, to feel like an underdog during a Twitter interaction with a child with 30 followers who struggles to afford to buy food. When their friends become distant or call them out, it's a confirmation of their righteousness rather than a wake-up call. Graham Linehan wrote in an article for the Daily Mail, for example, "I lost my career, my wife, friends and reputation when I was engulfed by a tsunami of trans rights madness." Yeah, trans people ended his marriage, not him, just trans tsunamis. And this is honestly partly pitiable from the outside, that while they rally around attempts to strip bodily autonomy and healthcare from trans people, or create conspiracy theories about secretly trans celebrities that they hate, or whatever else they get up to in their coven meetings, they see themselves as the hunted when people react to their actions. It's just a level of delusion that baffles me. But this connection of witches and persecution obviously doesn't come from nowhere. Witch hunts and stake burning cast a shadow over the history of witches in the English-speaking world, and has for centuries. America has the infamous Salem witch trials, fueled by racism and religious hysteria in the 1690s, but European witch hunts are estimated to have started in the 1300s, with the final recorded execution for witchcraft taking place in Switzerland in 1782. Although men were accused and tried for witchcraft, the majority of victims were women. According to historian Professor Diane Purkis, by the 1590s, the last decade of Elizabeth I's reign, the idea of the witch in England had crystallised as an old, very poor woman, lame or blind in one eye, and inclined to lose her temper over personal slights. Her dry, twisted and aging body was a kind of poison, and she was believed to be able to harm people and animals simply by speaking to them or looking at them. And so witches and death are intrinsically linked in our history, with tens of thousands executed across the years. There's even enshrined into law in England with the Witchcraft Act of 1542 by Henry VIII, which confirmed it to be a crime punishable by death. This was specifically seen as a pact with the devil, or enacting spiritual summoning or other sacrilegious rituals. This link to Satan, I think, is telling. There's something dangerous about the idea of a woman holding this kind of power herself. to blight crops or sicken families, and believing that on its own would be a blasphemous suggestion of supernatural works outside of the church's miracles. And so this supposed power then went against the will of God, and so must have been coming from something channeled through the women rather than the women themselves. Yet, betraying this scapegoat element of these accusations, if you fit the idea of the witch, then you were seen as an active participant rather than a victim. It wasn't that Satan had a hold on you and you had to be saved, it was that you had willingly courted the devil himself. It takes maybe 1 or 2 random videos on my channel to see where this is going in terms of this topic. The bury your gaze trope, the Hays Code, the history of morality plays, to put it simply, when it comes to fictional representation on screen, the history of Western cinema is heavily influenced by a code of ethics which were enforced in the 1930s to 60s, the Hays Code, which ensured that immoral characters like murderers or gay people weren't allowed happy endings in case it encouraged such behaviour in the audience, or at least suggested that it was okay. Hence, many sad or dead gays over the years. Even when the code was lifted, these ideas continued, especially at a time when queer people were still vilified, arrested, and discriminated against pretty universally across society. This combination of death as a central part of witch mythology and as a cornerstone in queer movie history means that it's no surprise that the two have combined on more than one occasion. At this point, I don't think it's a mystery as to the most obvious piece of representation in this section: the OG icon dead lesbian, killed by a stray bullet, paving the way for so many afterwards. Tara from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. She was quiet, she was sweet, she also suffered a random and untimely death which caused her girlfriend's descent into evil, villainous, witch big bad energy. This death lives in lesbian infamy. This couple were one of the first representations of a loving sapphic couple on television, especially for the teen group, but her death was sudden and brutal, and it came right after her and Willow reunited and had sex, which caused many to criticise the timing as even inadvertently connecting her sexuality and her tragic passing. Just when the lesbians get the happily ever after and enact their sinful lust in the privacy of her own bedroom, they're shot through the window by a stray bullet. It truly just a tale as old as time, you know? But looking at my research, there's actually a trend against this queer witch death curse in many cases. If we look at the wildly queer-coded example of Elphaba in Wicked, for example, we see a contextualization of the feared and hated Wicked Witch as a sympathetic protagonist instead. We know from The Wizard of Oz that she is hurtling through this musical towards death by bucket of water, and yet in the musical she lives. The ending we know for her is actually a trick. She's able to get her happy ending after all, and it isn't by being wholly good or making no mistakes. Indeed, her actions very often lead to tragic consequences. No good deeds goes unpunished, as she sings. But it is even more the fault of the society that she is in, one that ostracizes her and others like her, the misfits and the outcasts. The mob rule that would hunt her down without a fair trial. She is cast as the villain, and so she becomes one. A queer reading of the text still makes it a bittersweet ending between her and Glinda, but one that reverses and subverts the expected deadly end nonetheless. The idea of a character who says fuck it and embraces villainy forced on them has clear parallels to Agatha for me, where we are in the show right now. There's no denying that she is a villain. She admits to killing a whole ton of people and seems unconcerned with much suffering around her. But she's also a vaguely immortal being who has watched humankind age and die around her for hundreds of years, was persecuted by wider society and demonized by the people who were meant to be her family. She was told from birth that she was an evil mistake who would never change. And there's an implication in the show at this point that her powers, which work by draining other witches' powers, are not something she has full control over. Instead of the fearful, ever regretful figure that we might see in figures with similar power mechanics like Rogue, in Agatha we have someone who has deliberately cut herself off from compassion in order to survive this uncontrollable destructive power within. And yet we see with her past with Rio and her clear regret with the death of Alice that caring is something that forces its way through despite herself. Hello, it's Editing Rowan, and oh boy, do I have new things to add about Agatha now that I've seen the finale. I'm adding it into this section about death because it just felt appropriate, as we did finally get a kiss between Rio and Agatha, and it was a literal lesbian kiss of death. I, like many other viewers, was disappointed by the end of this season, and I kind of feel like my analysis of the show through the rest of this video hints at why. In a show full of mysteries and questions and hints and allusions, you want the finale to answer or at least clarify some of them, like in a detective show or a mystery or something like that. If you then end with the detective saying, "Oh, I don't know who did it," That's going to be at least a little bit disappointing, considering what the show itself would have been setting up, what the audience would have been expecting to have at the end to make for a satisfying ending. And I think this is especially true if you're talking about a story with a unique magic system and lore, even before talking about individual characters' backstories. You want to have a solid understanding of these elements to appreciate the stakes and possibilities, and also what isn't possible, but this finale made all of that more muddled when it came to Agatha herself for me. There are now just so many unanswered questions. The comments of every blog and video about the finale are full of people asking these questions or pointing out potential holes. And then 5 different utterly confident but completely conflicting responses and answers from people who have all come up with different ideas of how to answer those questions. And to me, if you're claiming to be answering these mysteries or questions or wonderings in the show itself as a writer, but then the audience can come up with completely different answers based on mostly speculation, those aren't really answers at all. Questions like, given her reaction to taking Alice's powers and that regret and confusion that we saw, how much can Agatha control her abilities after all, especially now that we've seen her stop for Billy? And why did Rio come for Nikki at that moment in time? Was it just random, or was it the coven killing to give Rio bodies to take instead of Nikki's, so she came on the day that Nikki stopped Agatha killing? And if so, why is Agatha still doing it? Is it to get powerful enough to bring Nikki back? And does the power absorbing even increase her powers or just drain the other witches? Because it didn't necessarily seem to directly correlate, obviously, with changes in her abilities. And when and how and why did Agatha even meet Rio? And what was their relationship like, considering how lovesick and romantic the she is my scar type scenes have been, only to leave us with the impression of Rio being a stalker in some one-sided obsessive relationship? I think that you can have reveals in a finale that recontextualize the rest of the show and have it work. In fact, they did it with Billy and the reveal that he created the road itself. We see how previous episodes make even more sense with this reveal. Same with Lylia's random outbursts being the result of her consciousness essentially time traveling in a unique kind of concept for a witch with prophetic powers. That was brilliant. That gave such an emotional pathos to her episode because everything got tied up together. Everything was related to itself. Everything was coming together to make sense, to make the whole more than the sum of its parts. That we could take all of these individual questions that we had about this character, and the answers that we were given within her episode made it even more satisfying. But the reveals around Agatha made a lot of the audience just sort of go, wait, what? The writers set up a finale where we would get the full truth, and it felt like we only got the surface of it. Agatha telling Rio that the reason that she lets people believe lies about her is because the truth is too terrible is setting us up for the reveal of a terrible truth that never really comes. She didn't sacrifice her son for the Darkhold, but there's no terrible thing to replace it with. Yes, she killed a lot of covens of witches, but everyone already knows about that, so it's not the truth that she's been keeping secret. There was this sort of black hole for me where flashbacks to Rio and Agatha's actual relationship should have been. Whatever their normal had been before the moment that Rio came for a meant-to-be stillborn Nikki. We get told about their intense relationship in ways, how much Agatha hating Rio has messed with Rio, she is my scar, all of that stuff, but we don't see the relationship that was destroyed. Just no context, no backstory. We literally get Jennifer asking, how did Agatha and Death meet, let alone get into a relationship? And the show then just gives us nothing. Unlike Sephi, who's giving us everything. Look at that little void. Look at her. Look at that witch's cat. Look at her go! This lack of both a clear grounding in the rules of Rio and Agatha's magic and powers, as well as a lack of clarity in their past and current relationship, means that the finale, kiss, and death sort of falls flat for me. The tension in this scene that should have been about us knowing enough to understand the risk or sacrifice or decision that Agatha was making, but instead, we didn't know what the kiss was going to do, so it was sort of okay, waiting to see the results of an action that we weren't entirely sure what the significance of it was before or after. Like, was this kiss Agatha meaning to die? Is the kiss of death a thing that kills everyone? Have they not been able to kiss until now? Did she think that Rio would love her enough to spare her? And like with Billy, how easy is it for Agatha to control her powers? Like, did it take actual strength of will to stop taking his power? Or was it like she just had to make the decision and then it was easy? It was the decision that was hard. Is it implying that his powers are so strong that Agatha hasn't even managed to deplete them significantly while taking them? I guess it's thematically resonant for this section on death to include my little finale rant here, because Agatha does die and is a ghost and doesn't seem that upset, so everything is chill and fine, I guess. At least this is going to inspire a veritable tsunami of fanfiction. So I'm off to AO3. Back to past Rowan. The queer witch death is particularly apt in the Fear Street trilogy as well. Between the two generations of queer girls, one couple dies tragically, but the other is saved. What at first seems like the fault of evil witches and their nefarious curses in the modern setting reveals itself to ultimately be the work of those who persecuted that witch. The original widower, Solomon Good, who made a pact with the devil, continued this deal through his bloodline, causing a rift between two neighbouring communities, the impoverished and run-down Shadyside, whose inhabitants are used as sacrifices to continue this spell by his descendants, and Sunnyvale, the part of town reaping the benefits for hundreds of years. The persecution of two individual queer girls thus becomes both thematically but also literally linked to wider social injustices, in the same way that homophobia in reality is not just isolated instances of hatred or fear. In a slasher horror trilogy, you expect death, but Fear Street ensures that the queer characters are not a disproportionate target, but are in fact the central characters for much of the three movies, and that the two modern leads live to survive and love and be very queer, while now knowing and understanding this previously besmirched piece of queer history and the girls who came before them. The future of queer witches. We've really hit a ramp up in queer witch media in the last few years, taking these elements of metaphorical and symbolic potential and running with them. I wanted to talk about what comes next. As you may have noticed, while we talked about a certain author, we didn't talk about that author's books in the examples throughout this video. So I wanted to give you some examples of books to fill the queer witchy holes in your shelves, because there are so many other books about magic that deserve our attention, ones that I'm hoping will potentially become the next generation of queer witch stories to make our way onto our screens. Books like The Spirit Bares Its Teeth, a gothic YA horror about Silas, an autistic trans boy in an alternate Victorian England who is able to commune with spirits, and whose desire to access the official magical pathways only open to cis men end with him being confined to a mysterious girls' finishing school until he is cured. If you know anything about this author's writing, then you know that you are in for a visceral, empowering, and in all ways haunting read. Honestly, he's one of my favourite authors right now, and he only has 3 books out, but every one of them is a must-read. There's also Cemetery Boys. A trans teenager sets out to prove to his family that he is a real brujo and accidentally summons a cute ghost. It's an urban fantasy romance that will make you believe in love and also in things that go bump in the night. There's also Mooncakes, an adorable and heartwarming read about a teen witch who works for her grandmother and rekindles a bond with her childhood crush, who is in fact a werewolf. Spellbound is a teen romance set in a magic school. It has magical rivalry, hijinks, awkward flirting galore. Truly, what more could you want in a YA novel? And the upcoming The Unmagical Life of Briar Jones, which is by my friend Lex Croucher. I was lucky enough to read a bunch of this book while they were writing it, and it is genuinely an unbelievably fantastic read. Basically a story exploring structural inequalities and elitism and abuses of power, set in a British magical school with a decidedly non-magical, non-binary lead character, Briar. What many of these books have in common is the centralising of queer stories from a wider range of experiences than we've seen in witch narratives on screen in the mainstream so far. The representation covered in this video is a lot of the kind of canonical queer witch representation, as well as some popular headcanons and coded characters as well, but for the most part we're talking about cis, white and able-bodied characters. The exceptions being like examples from The Owl House, Sabrina and Craft Legacy within this video. There still feels like a way to go here, especially in exploring ideas of witchcraft and magical traditions outside of the Western limits of mythology. Alongside that is the fact that the ideals of femininity that I talked about here For example, like the reasons why queerness and witchcraft feel connected in these stories are similarly defined by Western limits. Like the experience of sexualization of Black women, for example, will potentially have added layers of meaning and resonance when negotiating witchcraft, queerness, and sex. Adapting these books or other stories from a diverse range of voices has the potential to open up even more avenues of meaning and power across witch archetypes, creating a new generation of political and social defiance, or simply a bunch of fun characters that celebrate the magic of queerness itself. Thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video or other stuff that I put out, then please consider having a look at my Patreon. We are literally about to film a little extra that goes up for my patrons for every video about like bits that couldn't fit into this video, like other thoughts I've had, things that kind of ended up on the cutting room floor, as it were. So if you want to have a look at that or some of the other perks, then check that out. The link will be in the description. And please do leave in the comments any other examples of queer witches that you have enjoyed or things that you want to see from the future of queer witches on screen as well. Thanks once more to June's Journey for supporting the channel. Once again, you can download the game for free using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen now. I will leave links to my social media so you can find me all over the internet in the description, and until I see you next time, bye.